Okay, how many of you are singing in your local church? How many of you are having group singing in your local church? Like congregational singing? Okay, good. Then y'all won't be freaked out if I ask you to sing real quick. Put your mask on, we're going to sing, right? A member of our class is celebrating their birthday today by being with us. Greg Hazelrig, happy birthday. Let's sing. 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Greg Hazelrig. Bishop Man. Happy birthday to you and many more. Good job. Wasn't that fun singing together? Yeah. Oh, yeah. You should have kept that secret.
I didn't say it.
Oh, you let Sam say it, though. All right, Corey, kick that door, too, for me.
Yes, sir.
All right. Let's get started back. I'm going to pick up where I left off. We created some of our problems today by what we chose to do in 1939. What did we do in 1939 with the merger of the Emmy and Emmy South churches? Well, it still evolved around race. In 1939, with the merger of the Emmy and the Emmy South, we segregated the church with a central jurisdiction. At the insistence of the Emmy South, all African American, or predominantly African American churches ended up in the central jurisdiction. We had a major headquarters of, or a camp of the central jurisdiction in Mississippi. Anybody know what it was? Huh? Yeah, Gulf Shores. Yeah, Gulf Shores camp down in Waveland, Mississippi. Was like one of the great historic centerpieces. But we broke into jurisdictions, all of which were geographical, except the central jurisdiction was non-geographical and was made up of our African American churches. Again, continuing the sin of segregation and Jim Crow, and it was this at the insistence of the Emmy South. That's in 1939. Emmy and Emmy South merged to form the Methodist Church. Just became the Methodist Church. But we had already begun negotiating and talking about how we were going to move on from that and trying to lead to a merger with the EUB and the Methodist Church that would happen in 1968. So from 1939 to 1968, we had been working on it. Right? You can see that merger down at the bottom of the page. If you turn page 62, you will see the beginning of the section on the United Methodist Church organized. On page 71, I just want to draw your attention to this. You have another complete timeline on American women in the United Methodist Church. How they have led, and I'm going to comment about that a little bit. What now? 71. It's a whole timeline on women in the church. And how it connects with what's going on in the country at the time. All right? The first timeline is page 1 to 70. And it is produced by United Methodist Archives and History. You can find it at their website, but I've given it to you so you'd have a paper copy. The second one was produced by somebody else, but they also reference it on theirs. And if you go to page 99, you have the United Methodist African American timeline, 1619 through 1993, and it is also on the Archives and History webpage. I wanted you to have all three of those as a resource. So as we're negotiating from 1939 all the way up to 68 with the merger, we have to deal with structure, we have to deal with how we're going to elect bishops, and the church finally repented of its sin of the Central Conferences in 68, and there was a vast merger of all churches into jurisdictional conferences based on geography primarily. But we had to decide how all of that was going to work, and in the compromise at the insistence of the southern part of the church, the old ME South, we had geographic jurisdictions. Right? Geographic jurisdictions. And membership, what geographic jurisdiction you're in, was entirely dependent upon your membership. You also had the elections of bishops. Entirely within jurisdictions. There was a college of bishops and a council. What's the difference between the council of bishops and a college of bishops? Actually not. The council of bishops is made up of all elected bishops, both active and retired. That is the council. Now, we have since said that retired bishops no longer have a vote, but they do have a voice. And they do get a big chunk of the budget. But that's another story for another day. But the council of bishops is made up of all elected bishops, retired or otherwise, active, retired, or otherwise. They have some responsibilities within our current polity, but not much. The college of bishops are the bishops within a jurisdiction, elected and retired. The college of bishops within a geographic jurisdiction have far more influence on each other than the college of bishops, the council of bishops does. The college of bishops is, for us, the southeastern jurisdiction. And it's the bishops that are elected to serve within that jurisdiction. Up until 2019, could a bishop in the southeastern jurisdiction hold a bishop in the northeastern jurisdiction accountable for something they did? No, they could not. Could a laity in the southeastern jurisdiction hold a bishop bring charges against, hold a bishop in the northeastern jurisdiction accountable for something they did? Not unless you move there. You could not. There is no oversight, responsibility, or accountability across jurisdictional lines. I want you to understand that. Up until 2019, there was no, and I mean none, accountability across jurisdictional lines. Every jurisdiction operated like a free and independent church in and of itself, bound loosely by our book of discipline. Now, you will never hear that said out loud. You'll never hear anybody teach that. But each jurisdiction pretty much operated as its own church. It was the reality on the ground. Why is that? Why has that been what has developed over the years. Because to get the deal done, to do the merger between ME and ME South, the ME folks had to give up and allow the segregated central jurisdiction. Coming out of it, they said, never again, we will not do that. Handwriting was on the wall. We'd been through the civil rights movement, and people were starting to see this can't go on. So the ME South, or the people of the old ME South, said, okay, but here's the deal. We don't want no Yankee bishops coming down here in the southeastern jurisdiction telling us how to run our business. Let me say that again. We don't want no Yankee bishops. And you can read into it whatever they actually meant by that. Coming into the southeastern jurisdiction and telling us how to run our business. The good old boys in the SEJ said, no, we won't have to be separate. We can't have them coming down here and messing with our southern peculiarities. 50 years later, when people are screaming, how are we letting folks in the Northeast and the Western jurisdiction getting away with completely violating the discipline and electing an openly married lesbian bishop that has a marriage certificate in the state of California as a bishop and consecrating them as a bishop, even when the Judicial Council says that it is an invalid election and should not stand, but they don't have anybody to enforce it, and there's nobody else to enforce it other than the College of Bishops in the Western jurisdiction, and there's nothing anybody else can do about it. We are reaping what we sowed. Our chickens have come home to roost. It is our own fault. How many people in the Western jurisdiction vote on our bishops in the SEJ? None. How much of a vote do we get to say in who gets elected in the Western jurisdiction? None. We are reaping what we sowed. If we have issues, and I don't know where everybody stands on the human sexuality debate, and I frankly don't care today. I'm talking to us about structure, organizational theory. I'm not talking to us about that very narrow presenting issue, because that's all it is a presenting issue. Our differences are deeper, wider, and we need to understand how we have contributed to it. How many of you do, pastors, how many of y'all do pastoral counseling prior to a wedding or maybe after they get married and start having problems? Y'all do wedding counseling? How many of you use Prepare and Enrich? I do too. The conflict avoidance, how to deal with conflict, little one-page thing. The second question on it, and I give this to all my couples. The second question to ask is, how have you contributed to the problem? It makes the person that's got a problem ask how they contributed to the problem. And if we do not address and understand how we created this problem in the first place, we're liable to replicate it in the next. So we had in 1939 merger ME South. 1968 we brought the EUB and the Methodist Church together. We formed jurisdictions, and that was the last merger that we've been through. That is a huge milestone in the life and history of the church. I would commend you to hold on to that. That is a good resource for you.
And for kicks and giggles, did you know there's still EUB churches in existence?
Yeah, they split off their, what are they called now?
No, these are like legit old school EUB churches in Pennsylvania that are actually right next door to Methodist churches.
Yeah.
Which is crazy, but they still function together.
Do they call themselves EUB?
Yeah.
I knew that there was, a lot of those churches didn't go with the merger. I didn't think they had the authority to use the EUB language.
This one was, these are actually still part of the United Methodist Church, but they actually still have EUB on their side.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Do any of them still use German?
No, the ones that I know was in conversation with, they do not.
There, up until the merger, there were a significant number of EUB churches that did their worship fully in German. Still. 1968, they were still doing worship in German. I would love, if you can find one that still do it in German, I'll pay for me and you a plane ticket. I'd love to go see it. And the differences between EUB and Methodist Church, theologically, were not at all. Culturally, a lot of difference. The EUB seminaries, United in Dayton, Ohio, was one of the old EUB seminaries. By and large, they were more traditional and more conservative and more holiness than the Methodist Church. How many of you brought a discipline with you today? Anybody bring a discipline? Okay. If you look at the front, there is the Confession of Faith of the Methodist Church and also of the EUB Church. And you can read those side by side and get a little take on the differences. Now, how long have we got? Gosh, we'll have to start cutting stuff. Okay, I got 15 minutes. Okay. All right, so we're rolling. All right, ready? We now have become a global Big C church. Why have we become a global Big C church? Is because we are a church in the same manner as the Episcopals, the Anglican Communion, the Catholics, the Lutherans. The Methodist Church, the United Methodist Church, is global in scope. Now, we are not in every country everywhere, but the Methodist movement is everywhere. What are the continents that we currently have churches on as the United Methodist Church?
North America, South America, Africa. Going to Asia.
Philippines?
Yeah, right.
Europe?
Obviously, yes, sorry, forgot about it.
What's the fastest growing church in Europe in the Methodist? What area of the Methodist Church in Europe is the fastest growing? What? No, in Europe.
I'm going England.
Huh?
Eastern Europe.
Eastern Europe? Russia? Russian Methodist Church? What's the fastest growing part of the church? What now? Hold that thought. Who said that? Remind me to come back to the home church. Okay. Okay, so we have a presence in all of these places. South and Central America. Okay. In Eastern European, you got the Russian Methodist Church is huge. We're in Estonia. Anybody got any other places we're at that I'm forgetting? Russia, Estonia, Latvia. What's a couple others? Europe. Largest representation is in Germany. But there's very few Methodists left in Europe, as there are very few churches and Christians left in Europe. Asia. Philippines. We actually have the largest Methodist, not United Methodist, but the largest Methodist named church in the world is in Seoul, South Korea.
South Korea, yeah.
72,000, I think. No, 272,000, sorry. 272,000, I think, members. 200-something thousand members. Man, it's a huge church in Seoul, South Korea. I met their pastor. He works with Asbury Seminary. He's an Asbury Seminary graduate through the Beeson program there. The Philippines, Korea, although it is an independent freestanding church, they do send representatives to our general conferences, and we send representatives to their general conference. What is the fastest growing Methodist church in Southeast Asia? Vietnam. Methodist church is exploding in Vietnam. Africa, of course, we've known. What is the largest annual conference in Africa? Anybody know? It's North Katanga. And it's in DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo. Anybody want to take a guess how many Methodists are in the DRC?
150,000. You said take a guess.
DRC has anywhere from 2 to 3 million. 2 to 3 million. They got 5 annual conferences. Their bishop in the North Katanga annual conference is serving 300 to 400,000 folks. Pretty big annual conferences. Considering the lack of infrastructure and good roads, it's kind of tough. I had the pleasure going there in 2015 to Lubumbashi, DRC, and met the bishop and was in the town square. And the largest employer in the city of Lubumbashi and the largest, you saw the cross and flame everywhere. It was amazing. Just the size of, that was a Methodist town, Methodist city of 1.5 million people. The Methodist influence was everywhere. The largest building in the town center belonged to the Methodist headquarters in town, the bishop's office. So, South and Central America, we do have growing churches there that are booming. Argentina, where our bishop has preached before. Brazil, strong, all independent. Nicaragua, Mexico, Costa Rica. All of these are independent churches in Central and South America. But there's one that is exploding. Matter of fact, they talk about it as the blank revival. Anybody want to guess? If you ever get a chance, go. The Cuban revival. At one point in time, the Methodist Church in Cuba got down to 2 people. And now it's the fastest growing part of our movement in Cuba. We are a big C church. And I'm not even mentioning every group here of independent breakaway churches. Again, churches that were once part of Methodism as a part of a missionary outreach that broke away and formed an independent church. The Methodist Church of Nicaragua, the Methodist Church of Mexico, the Methodist Church of Costa Rica, the Methodist Church of Argentina, the Methodist Church of Brazil. They are freestanding independent churches, but they have relationships with us. They have what we call concordat agreements. Concordat. That means they will send 1 or 2 delegates to our general conference, and we will send 1 or 2 delegates to their general conference. As a matter of fact, in 2019, a bishop in the Mexican Methodist Church who was sent as a delegate to our 2019 Special Call General Conference was not seated with our Council of Bishops, was on the floor as a delegate, actually made it to a microphone and offered a speech in 2019. A concordat representative from another church. So, I call us a Big C church, and that's not my nomenclature. Billy Abraham, who was the Albert Outler Professor of Methodist Theology at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. Billy Abraham was the first that I heard that coined this phrase, is that Methodism has moved from being a mainline denomination in America to becoming a Big C church. Just like the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Lutheran Church. We are a Big C global church. Church that began with Asbury and Coke, expanded with America, sent out missionaries all over the world that birthed these churches in Africa and Asia, and in Russia, South America. All of these were born out of missionary movements. Missionary movements. All right. All right, we're now going to shift gears into our polity. This is a section on polity. I'm going to try to catch you up on everything you need to know about. I think I've given you the fast ride through history. There's a lot more nuance there. I wished I had time to spend with you talking about more of the nuanced parts of our history. But yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the first structure. Number one, General Conference. How many of you been to General Conference? Been to a General Conference? Okay. It is a very interesting event. It is the gathering once every quadrennium, which is a fancy way of saying once every 4 years. If you haven't noticed, we as Methodists like big words. Makes us feel smarter. Makes us feel not so inferior to the Presbyterians, who like to inform us all the time that they're superior. Quadrennium, every 4 years. It is a group of delegates from 650 to 1,000 members based on a formula that represents all annual conferences plus concordat churches. That's how the delegates are made up. All annual conferences are apportioned membership out of that 650 to 1,000, and the concordat churches. Like the Methodist Church in Mexico gets 4 delegates because of that's written into their concordant agreement. The General Conference is the only body that can speak for the UMC. Let me say that again. The General Conference is the only body in the world that can speak on behalf of the United Methodist Church. Can I speak on behalf of the United Methodist Church? No. Can I tell you what I think? Sure. But it's just me speaking. Right? Can a district superintendent speak on behalf of the United Methodist Church? Sure. They can tell you what they think, but it's just them speaking. Can a bishop speak on behalf of the United Methodist Church? No. But they can tell you what they think, what's their idea. But they do not speak for the church.
Do they also speak for the concordant churches?
The concordant churches it depends on what is actually in the concordat agreement. Most of them no. They have their own general conferences that speak for them. They are not bound by that we do. We are in relationship, but we can't bind them and they can't bind us. Does that make sense? So we could go to their general conference, we could speak and say this is a bad idea, might even have a vote. Some of our concordant churches actually have a vote, but we do not speak on their behalf. No one speaks for the church except the church. And the church is the general conference sitting in session as set by the discipline or as called, a special called general conference by the Council of Bishops. Jeff.
Somebody needs to tell the media about that who reports on the UMC.
Well, they assume a lot. Here's the thing is people that write for the media, number one, don't listen to them because they don't know what they're doing. Right? Most of them have a bachelor's degree and they were not the best in their class in English. Because it just didn't work out that way. So number one, don't pay attention to the media. Don't get invested in them. Number two, they don't ask the right question because most of them are not us. They don't know. And you have to dig in and do your research. And most people don't care enough to do that, right? Most people just don't care enough. So like Jeff says, yeah, we need to inform them. So that when I don't speak to the media anymore I never have, I guess, but I don't speak to the media, but in the moments when I have spoken to the media, I'm always very clear that I say these things like, well, nobody can bind the church, and nobody speaks on behalf of the church but the General Conference. Some of our members and some of our advocacy groups and some of our caucus groups and some of our bishops, I don't think realize this. I just don't. I don't think people get that the only group that speaks for the church, that can bind the church, can set the church doctrine, and say and define what it is those of us that are elected to the delegation sitting in General Assembly. Period. And I've had the innominable pleasure and just been so blessed by you to be elected to represent you in the last 4. This will be my 4th General Conference. Well, we had the 2 extra ones, right? So there's an awful lot of enormity sitting on that floor casting a vote when you understand that. But most people don't understand that. The other thing that is an enormity that the General Conference does is it sets the apportionment system, the formula. It speaks to the church, it sets the discipline. It is really the governing body. So how do I go about, if let's say I wanted to sue the United Methodist Church, could I sue the United Methodist Church? How would it go? Let's say I'm mad at the United Methodist Church. Let's say I walk out of church here today and I step in a hole and I break my ankle and I'm going to sue the Maples Memorial Methodist Church and I'm going to sue that old preacher there and I'm going to sue the district superintendent and the district and the Mississippi Annual Conference, but I want to sue the United Methodist Church too. They ought to require their churches to fix their potholes. Who do I sue? Corey, who do I sue?
I was actually just trying to figure that out. I couldn't remember. I don't know.
You can't.
You can't sue the United Methodist Church.
The United Methodist Church does not legally exist.
That makes sense.
Doesn't legally exist. There is no corporate body, there's no entity known as the United Methodist Church that is amenable for pseudo process and can have process served on it that you can exert personal jurisdiction over. There's no.
I remember in seminary, we were actually going over some of this in the polity, and the question was asked, so then who actually owns or who actually is the United Methodist Church? And the answer was exactly.
Exactly.
Like it's a sleight of hand.
Well, who has control of our mark, the cross and flame and the name UMC, the trademark? That is held by the CFNA, Council of Finance and Administration, GCFA, General Commission on Finance and Administration. They hold the copyright for the cross and flame and the name United Methodist Church. And by discipline, they are given the authority to use that copyright to protect the mark. But there is no United Methodist Church to sue. Where then and who then holds the trust to your property?
Annual conference.
It begins and ends with the annual conference. The United Methodist Church is a collection of annual conferences, but the ultimate power and authority really rests within the annual conference. The general church passes a budget. They say, here's your portions, right? And if we don't pay them, right, you hear me? You see what I'm saying here? There's no hammer. There's a carrot, but there's no hammer. There's a carrot, no stick, right? Unless they say, okay, here's their stick. Well, we're going to drop you from the pension program, right? That's the stick, which only affects your preachers. Westpath is our pension holder, our pension organization, and they work for the general church. But they are also now a freestanding 501c3 corporation, so they can contract with anybody, and are. Because why? because they're really good at what they do. I mean, right, David? I mean, they're pretty good at it. They're pretty good at what they do. But they're a separate 501c3. The general church is made up of boards and agencies. Can anybody name the boards and agencies?
Board of Higher Education.
Huh?
Board of Higher Education.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put GCFA. We already talked about them. General Commission on Finance Administration. General Board of Church and Society, GBCS. We have General Board of Higher Education and Campus Ministry. Right? Higher Education and Campus Ministry.
I can't remember if campus is underneath it, but I do know that.
Campus Ministry is either underneath it or is a co-equal with it. All right, higher education. What else? Church and Society, Higher Education, Finance and Administration. West Path, which used to be known as the General Board of Pensions and Health Benefits. How many of you know that West Path actually has a health insurance program? We don't participate in Mississippi, but they actually do have a health insurance program. It's called Health Flex. Don't know much about it. Right. What else?
Is Encore?
Encore will be a part of the General Board of GBGM, right? No, General Board of Encore, General Board of Global Missions, GBGM. Has under it Encore and them. So General Board of Global Missions. GB, General Board of Discipleship Ministries, right? General Board of Discipleship, that used to be where you'd have the publishing house, you'd have the people that produce the hymnal, worship, Lenten studies, Bible studies, all that kind of stuff. Coach Berry. Although Coach Berry is again a separate corporation now, with a really confusing website. Sorry. I got to get that dig in every time. What else?
Where's communications come under?
UMCOM comes under GCF&A. General Board of Archives and History. General Board, B's laying down on me. General Board of Archives and History. We also have COSRO, Committee on the Status and Role of Women, right? Have the General Commission on Race and Religion, GCOR. COSRO, GCOR, Archives and History, Discipleship Ministries, Global Ministries, West Path, Higher Education, Church and Society, Finance Administration. I think that's getting closer to it. I think that's about it. If you can think of another one added up there. These occupy most of your budget, and they're intended to do certain things. This is where it operates. This is where our church operates at its global level and does some really good things. has done some really good things over the years. Most time people just didn't know about it, and they had the ability to access it. How many of you got a sign built by UMCOM? Like you got a sign out in front of your church that lights up and has a scrolling announcements on it that paid for by UMCOM. They had a program a few years ago where if you'd apply for a grant, they'd give you the money to build that sign. They discontinued it. Why? Nobody was applying for it. They didn't know about it. They wanted to give away free money to buy a sign, and they had to quit because nobody knew about it. And nobody had applied. Right? And their name is Communications. Sorry. Higher education deals with youth, campuses, student ministry, what else, Corey? Camping, scholarships, that's other thing.
Loans.
Scholarships, yeah. Big giver of scholarships. Where else can, if you have a senior graduating this year, where else can they apply for scholarships from the Methodist Church?
Methodist Foundation.
Methodist Foundation in Jackson has a deadline coming up in a couple of, maybe a month even. It's not long off.
Usually June 1st.
June 1st, okay, so usually June 1st you can apply. If you are a member of the United Methodist Church and you're graduating and going off to college this year, you can get up to, I think like $1,000 from them. You can do it either once during, I mean, it would take you all the way through your college career. You can either do it while you're getting your undergraduate, or if you want to wait, you can do it later if you're going to get a graduate degree. But you can't do it in both. They'll do it at one time. Call Mike Hicks at the foundation, and he can get you hooked up. All right. West Path, of course, pensions and benefits. Who is the most trusted party in the Methodist Church? Anybody got a guess? Most trusted, most well-received, most respected, the least partisan part of the whole United Methodist Church. Anybody got a guess? What do you think? What do you think is the least partisan? Huh? Okay. That, I mean, close, yeah, close.
I like West Path.
West Path is always, in all the, every time you survey, West Path scores the highest in trust factor, the highest in nonpartisanship. You know why that is? They're all accountants, and they're just trying to save you some money. And we all like that. They are. Now, West Path is paid to look into the future. Right now, there's a debate going on whether we're going to separate as the United Methodist Church, and that's what you're here. I know that's what most of you are here today to hear. Okay. How long has West Path been anticipating this?
Wow.
They began working in the late 90s towards this inevitability. And they made the actuarial, they adjusted their actual, let me say this again. They made the internal adjustment of their actuarial tables in 2000 for this inevitability, 20 years ago. They saw it coming, saw the handwriting on the walls, and went ahead and made their internal adjustments that they did to in 2000. These guys are smart. And they also see their handwriting on the walls. So, all right, these are the bodies. What else makes up the General Conference? What other entities exist within the General Conference? Well, you have the General Conference officers, okay? Let's see where that time was. So General Conference officers there's a committee called the General Commission on the General Conference, GCGC. They were the ones that met last week and said, hey, we are bumping 2021 to 2022. Okay, so you got General Commission on the General Conference. You have the Secretary of the General Conference, who certifies all legislation, has certain disciplinary responsibilities. So there's the Secretary of the General Conference. Anybody know who that is? Who the Secretary of the General Conference is? His name is Gary Graves. And he's from Louisville. It's not Mississippi, it's Louisville, Kentucky. He's in Louisville, Kentucky. Gary Graves. He has been that since 2016. The General Commission of the General Conference is elected at each General Conference. They are nominated through the standard committee of nominations. Yes, the General Church has a nominating committee too. General Commission on the General Conference. Okay. They are the ones that decide where we're going to have it, They decide the how. They set up the committees on reference and credentials. That means they decide whether your credentials are enough for you to be seated as a delegate. Reference decides on whether you've actually followed the rules for submitting this piece of legislation and if it's going to get allowed to come forward as legislation, and deciding which legislative committee it's going to, breaking it up. Which way is it going to go? So they decide the where and the how, and to a certain extent the when, right? Although we're going to see in a minute that can be overridden. The where, the how, and the when. They also decide the who. I'm pausing for a moment for those of you that are my age and older to quit singing in your head, who are you? Because I know somebody went there with me, right? And good luck, you're going to have it in your head the rest of the day. Who. They decide the who. Okay, so in 2016, there was a lot of kerfuffle over how many delegates were going to General Conference. Why was there a kerfuffle? Well, because generally what they had done up until then is they plugged in everybody's membership into the formula, and then whatever kicked it out was fine, unless it was below 650 or above 1,000. If there was more than 1,000, they'd have to adjust it to get back to 1,000. And if it was below 650, they'd adjust it to get it up to 650, but they didn't generally mess with it. In 2016, for the 2016 General Conference, they made the decision as they wanted to move closer to 650. The 2012, we'd had nearly 900, 860 something, I think, but somewhere in the 800s, and they adjusted us lower, closer to the 650 number for 2016, because they wanted to move to a smaller General Conference, less voting delegates. Quite a kerfuffle. The General Commission on the General Conference has a great deal of power. Why? Because they control the process. If you control the process, you control. And so they absolutely have a ton of control over how things happen. This is the group that said, can't have General Conference in 2020, COVID, peace out, we'll see you in a year from now. They got to this spring, looked at it and said, yeah, we got these other variants coming. We can't do distributed. For our international clients, it's going to cost us an arm and a leg, because they may cost us anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000 to get them a visa each person. And they hemmed and hawed around and looked at the budget and said, all right, can't do it in 2021. Peace out. We'll see you in 2020. All right? So the General Commission on the General Conference has a lot of authority over the actual function of the General Conference. Who can override them? Who can override the General Commission on the General Conference?
Voting delegates?
Only if you're already there sitting in general session. Yes, to a certain extent. The Council of Bishops has the authority to call a special called General Conference on a limited subject matter and give that to the General Commission and say, it will be this time, it will be at this place, you're going to do it this way, and this is the only subject that can be taken up. Now that's a lot of power. And that's what happened here in the last 2 weeks. General Commission on the General Conference said we can't do it, can't make it work, we're going to push it out till August 2022. And the bishop said, all right, then we're going to call a special call General Conference for May 8th. It's going to be to do one issue, which is vote to suspend the rules to allow paper ballots. And then we're going to send paper ballots out on these 12 items that we need you to vote on so that we can do the business of the church. And we can't do it without that. And they give that back to the General Commission to plan and call off, or to pull off. But there's one other group that might have a voice in whether that is actually legitimately done or not. And they're also elected at General Conference. Think of it like another branch of the government. The Judicial Council. I'm running out of space, but the Judicial Council is also elected. Right? It's made up of 9 persons and a bunch of reserves. They're elected from the whole global church, and they decide cases and controversies. They can also be called upon, unlike our court systems in America, they can be called upon to make, to prejudge the constitutionality of a specific thing if it's appealed in the right way. I'm not going to bother you with all the details, but there is a process where the bishops can put something in front of them and where you can put something in front of them prior to its passage. But you might need the help of a bishop to make that happen too. So let's say that we have a piece of legislation in Mississippi that comes up and you're like, I really don't want us passing this. I don't think this is right. I chair the Committee on Petitions and Resolutions, right? And let's say I got something rolling up into petitions and resolutions, and you're like, man, we don't need to even talk about this one. I don't even want to talk about that. That's, woo. Let's say, where's my Bulldog fans in here? Let's say that somebody that's a big Bulldog fan puts out a petition that says on Fridays at annual conference we're going to all wear maroon. You can't be admitted to the building unless you wear maroon because we wear maroon on Fridays because they're a Bulldog fan. Let's say you're an Ole Miss or a Southern fan. You're like, oh, I don't even vote on that. That's going to tear us apart. So before it ever gets to the floor, before I get up and walk up to the microphone and open my mouth, and you raise your hand and run to a microphone and say, Bishop, point of order. He says, all right, Hazelrig, microphone number 2. And Greg says, Bishop, I would like a ruling of law on the constitutionality of this pending legislation. And he has 24 hours to make a ruling of law, and it freezes the legislation. And then he can appeal it. Let's say the bishop says, no, it's constitutional. Meanwhile, he's ringing his cowbell under the table, right? And it's constitutional. Well, Greg can say, well, hold up, I don't think so, and I'm going to appeal it. And he can appeal it to the Judicial Council, right? Ultimate arbiter of whether anything is legal or not, or is constitutional or not, is up to those 9 people. Every year there is legislation, or every 4 years there's legislation that ends up on the floor of General Conference that is immediately appealed to the Judicial Council. Some of it's struck down and some of it's sustained. And the ones that are struck down never even make it to the floor. Because people ask for a ruling ahead of time, preliminary ruling. There were pieces of the traditional plan in St. Louis that were struck down by the Judicial Council before we even got to St. Louis. And what they said is that they made the preliminary ruling that it's not constitutional. And so that allowed some of us to go back and rework it and rework the language to make it constitutional. And so we were prepared to offer amendments to make that portion constitutional. We just never could get the floor to make the amendments. Do what now?
So do we have a constitution?
We do. We do. Let me look it up in my discipline. Anybody got a paper copy of the discipline with them? Somebody look up the Constitution, and I'll quote the page number for y'all. I always keep mine on my Kindle. I can just search it quicker.
Don't they also decide the constitutionality of whatever has been approved?
Say that again.
After something's been approved?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They vote on the constitutionality. All right, has anybody got their book out, their discipline out? Okay. I didn't bring mine down here.
That's okay, I can look at it.
Yeah, give me half a second. I'll give it back to you. Constitution is on page 25 through page 43, paragraphs 1 through 61. Particular importance is to look at paragraph 13 through 16, which governs the General Conference. To change the Constitution requires a constitutional amendment. And a constitutional amendment to be passed requires a 2/3 vote of the delegates at General Conference, plus a cumulative 2/3 votes of all annual conferences. That doesn't mean Mississippi has an up or down, okay, we passed Mississippi. It means 2/3 of every Methodist that votes at every annual conference. What you do is Mississippi votes, and we count our yeses and no, and we send our total number in. Alabama votes, yeses and no's, send the number in. And they add up all the yeses and add up all the no's, and it must pass by 2/3. It is the aggregate. So to change the Constitution requires not only 2/3 of the delegates, but 2/3 aggregate of every United Methodist voting at an annual conference anywhere. Every Methodist delegate to an annual conference. Right? So, you think it might be a little hard to pass a constitutional amendment? Is that a word? Yes. Beyond belief, it is almost impossible to get a constitutional amendment passed, particularly if it's controversial. Because you got that 2/3, 66 and 2/3, whatever that number works out to be. But they're very, the Judicial Council is very, very important as part of our structure, because we in the Methodist Church have modeled our structure off of a U.S.-centric government model, where we have the judicial branch, right? Well, that didn't work out very good. Okay, let's try this again. J. There we go. Judicial branch, and we have the executive, and we have the legislative. What's the legislative? Well, that's General Conference. What is the judicial? Well, Judicial Council. And executive branch is Council of Bishops, right? And so that's the balance of power within the denomination itself. Balance of power within the denomination itself. So we have this whole structure, All right. Jeff, will you do me a favor? Would you go out there and ask Sam to bring me the whiteboard cleaning solution? Thanks. All right. Okay. All right, the next level down is the jurisdictional conference. Okay? Which is kind of a misnomer. Because it really isn't. You have the general church up here. And underneath the general church, you have the jurisdictions within the U.S., and you have the central conferences outside the U.S. Jurisdictions within the U.S. and central conferences outside the U.S. Thanks. Guys, I'm going to clean the board real quick if y'all don't mind. I'll rewrite this. It's starting to bother me. So you have the general church, you have the jurisdictions, and central conferences. While they may look almost identical, there are distinctions between the central conferences and the jurisdictions. There are things that central conferences can do that jurisdictions cannot do. There are things that jurisdictions can do that central conferences can do. I'm not going to bog us down into going through all of that. But one of the chief things, probably or maybe the only thing that's pertinent for our discussion today, is that central conferences can adapt the book of discipline in some areas. What might be an area they adapt the book of discipline?
For their own culture. Something's legal or illegal in their country.
No, not really.
Property?
There you go. How many churches in Africa actually own their own property and have actually own a church?
Probably next to none.
Next to none. Most of them don't. Property and casualty insurance requirements. Pensions for clergy. Clergy, how many of you are invested in the pension program? Ask that question in Africa. They don't get pensions. Most of the time they don't get much of a salary. Same in the Philippines. Right? Okay. So, taking a look at the differences, the chief difference is really that they get to adapt the book of discipline around those kinds of things. And then some areas that it is probably a little more of an extension, other than just perfunctory, kind of housekeeping issues, is they get to do some cultural adaptations, yes, particularly around the order of service and how they do some of the stuff that they put out for order services, structure services, how they structure their local leadership. They get some areas where they are treated differently. But yet the jurisdictions also have responsibilities that the central conferences don't. Jurisdictions are bound geographically. There's different standards for how they elect bishops. Bishops in the central conference are term limited. Yep. Term limited. They can serve 8 years. What about in our jurisdictions? They serve for life. Now the bishops over there retain the title of bishop, and most often they end up serving in some capacities even after leaving, like they serve in seminaries and stuff. But there is great autonomy given in central conferences around educational standards. But otherwise, they're very similar. Can anyone name our jurisdictions?
Southeast, west, northeast, central, hang on. Texas? North central, that's right.
5. SEJ, Southeastern Jurisdiction, Southwestern Jurisdiction, the Western Jurisdiction, North Central Jurisdiction, Northeastern North Central is Midwest. SEJ is South. SWJ is primarily Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, somewhere in there. So, yeah. Western jurisdiction is Western U.S. Primarily the Western U.S. And NEJ is the Northeast, again, Northeastern jurisdiction. They vary in size. What's the largest one? Largest jurisdiction? Southeastern jurisdiction is the largest.
By population or geography?
Population. Geographic, it's the Western. So, how many members are in the Western jurisdiction? What was their last count on their membership? A little under 300,000. So let's just round them up to 300,000 in the entire Western United States. How many members are there in the North Georgia Conference? Somewhere around 320,000. How many bishops in the Western jurisdiction? 5. Serving 7 Episcopal areas. Or there's 7 annual conferences and 5 Episcopal areas. Right? North Georgia gets 1 bishop. So, anyway, there you go. That's our jurisdictional breakdown right now. The next largest would be, number 1 would be SEJ, number 2 would be SWJ, North Central and Northeastern are 3 and 4. I mean, they're both very similar. Number 5 is Western. But the Western jurisdiction has the largest concentration of a very large minority group within our church, the Korean Methodists. They still conduct worship sometimes in Korean, and though that Western jurisdiction is really the centerpiece for that. All right, so we've seen general conference, we've seen jurisdictional conferences. I've talked a little bit about central conferences. All right, so let me talk about annual conferences.
Before you move on, how often does jurisdictional conference meet?
Okay, jurisdictional conference. Great question. Great question. Okay, so let me look back to that. Jurisdictional conferences meet once every 4 years, quadrennially, but they cannot meet until after. They cannot meet until after a general conference. They can only meet. They have to have a general conference in order to meet.
Same year?
Same year, yeah. So when we postponed 2020 to 2021, we ended up having to bump the jurisdictionals. So when we bumped it again, we had to bump our jurisdictionals again. Okay? So there you go. Let me stop. I've been running really hard. What, if any, questions do you have up until now about structure or polity?
I had a question on jurisdictional, judicial council. Do they take into consideration the laws of the land or only our own polity and doctrine?
Only our polity. They are bound to, they decide cases and controversies within the church based on
That's what I thought.
purely the polity of the UMC.
So does each punting of the general conference then push Swanson's retirement every year?
Well, according to the discipline, he cannot serve after his 72nd birthday
Right, yeah, it's forced retirement.
as an appointed bishop.
Okay.
But he could serve in retirement as a bishop. Right? We have that happen all the time. But he can't be retired until you have a jurisdictional conference.
So he's in limbo.
Well, okay, so, all right, can we talk?
Does this mean the camera goes off?
No. Look, I'm not going to say anything today that I wouldn't say standing in front of Bishop Swanson or any of the council of bishops or my district superintendent. My district superintendent's here today. It's all recorded for posterity. It's going out on Facebook. Will go out on Facebook. We're going to chop it up into sections because nobody's going to sit down and watch a 6-hour video. So, I mean, it's bad form. But since January, there's been a lot of movement. I'm going to speak to you. I'm taking the hat off as the teacher. I'm putting the hat on as a delegate to General Conference. You're elected delegate. Since January of this year, there has been several meetings that we as the delegation have been called to. Right? Now, we didn't go anywhere. We just went online. We had a Zoom meeting. We had a Zoom meeting with SEJ delegates in January, and then we had another Zoom meeting with all U.S. delegates in February. And the chief topic of conversation and the major presentation that was made to us was about the Episcopal Fund running out of money. According to their projections, the Episcopal Fund will run out of money in 2024. Although this year, it was really bad for a big chunk of the year, but at the end, everybody finished up pretty strong, and our collections were pretty decent. As far as the general church goes, if you look at the general church, generally you collect about 86% of the, you never collect 100% every year. But generally the general church collects about 86% of the Episcopal Fund. Last year they collected, I think, like 84. It wasn't that bad. Not a bad year at all, particularly considering COVID and everything. They have been running in the red, for multiple quadrenniums. Meaning they built up a reserve, now they're burning through the reserve. That's not even considering the 5 additional bishops that were committed to by the General Conference of 2016 to Africa. When the Congo Central Conference has got 2 to 3 million people, or the Congo Episcopal area has 2 to 3 million people, and you got one bishop serving 2 to 3 million people, they need another bishop or 2, right? They need 5. To say they need 5 bishops in Africa is like, I don't even have a good country southern metaphor for that. It's just, that's not enough. They need 25. But we agreed to fund 5. And the Episcopal Fund by 2024 supposedly will be bankrupt, and that's not even considering the 5 extra bishops. So in those 2 meetings, we have done nothing but discuss. We've done a few other things, but primarily we've discussed how we've got to get to a jurisdictional conference so that we can retire the retiring bishops, and then let's not elect any new bishops so that we don't burn through that fund. So the suggestion that's coming from the study commission in the Southeastern jurisdiction and the Council of Bishops Study Commission headed by David Graves, Bishop Graves from South Alabama, West Florida, who ran for bishop the same year I did. He got elected. I didn't, but otherwise I wouldn't be sitting here. But that study commission said that they are going to suggest that we retire all the bishops that could be retired and not elect any new bishops to save money. So that means that multiple bishops will have to be covering multiple annual conferences. So, Corey, I can't tell you. Now, David Stotts is a very bright guy. And so he's figured out an idea, and we have forwarded it on, and we have endorsed it. and it's pretty sharp. That annual conferences absorb the cost of the office for the bishop, right? Bishops, we pay their office expense. And we're going to ask, he said we should ask annual conferences to pick that up. And then we should ask bishops to serve in retirement, because most of their salary will be paid by Westpac, not coming out of the Episcopal fund. And all the church would have to, or the annual conference would have to do would be pick up the difference between their pension and their salary, whatever that is. I think it's a wise move, but we'll see. But I think it's very interesting. I think it's very interesting that for the first 2 months of the year, in 2 Zoom call meetings of delegates, our primary discussion has been around the sustainability of the Episcopal Fund. Yeah, Jeff?
Is that in part to people are giving less to that line item?
No, like I said, 86% average collection rate on an average year. Last year it was 84. Doesn't seem to have moved a lot. Now, it was way low at one point during COVID, but everything else was too. Any other questions? Okay, so let's talk about.
I've got one.
Yeah.
There been any talk of how you fix the Episcopal fund? You know, I hear so much like, well, we just gotta adjust everything down, instead of let's build everything up.
Okay, so help me understand your question.
Okay, we're saying we can't afford bishops because we don't have money.
That's what they're saying.
Right. So is there any discussion on how we get more money for that fund?
Yes and no. They could budget a whole lot more, doesn't mean they're going to get a whole lot more in. I think a more productive conversation would be about why does it cost so much to have a bishop?
Okay.
And why are they so expensive in retirement? To me, that seems like a better question.
Better question. Okay.
And full disclosure, I have helped draft the proposed doctrine and discipline for the Wesleyan Covenant Association. I have read and worked on every word of it. And one of the parts of it that I'm the most proud of is a recovering of the teaching component, the teaching office, the bishop. We have turned them into glorified administrators, and they were once teachers that guarded the doctrine. And perhaps that's where they should move back to. And perhaps they might be cheaper to maintain that way. Because you're stealing my thunder. Stop. You're making me tip my hand. But I just want to say, perhaps one of the things that we lost when we left this was we moved from a bottom-up structure to a top-down structure. Maybe that's the difference, is that everything starts at the top and rolls down, and maybe we ought to move back to it. Right? Will there be churches that close? Yeah. Will some small membership churches close? Yeah, because they won't be sustainable. And we've got to be okay with that. And I say that as somebody who has served small membership churches and large membership churches. Everything has a season. Nothing is permanent except God. And things have seasons. But also being a very small membership church doesn't mean that you have to die. Jeff, help me with this a little bit. How bad a shape was Sunflower United Methodist Church.
Well, it wasn't growing.
It had gotten down to about 4 little old ladies. It was in an old church, an old school. The roof had collapsed in parts of it. It was a church that was dying. And they sent a pastor there to shut her down. Just shut it down, just close it. Just 4 little old ladies. Be all right. Except Veronica is hard-headed, strong-willed, and believes that God has a mission for everybody. And she just didn't take no for an answer and didn't know how to quit. So she started looking at that going, man, we could really use, this is a great facility that just needs, this is an old school. It's a huge, old 1950s school in Sunflower, Mississippi. And she caught a vision for bringing in mission teams to work on housing issues in the Delta. Because one of the biggest needs in the Delta is substandard housing. Deferred maintenance, people living in very poor living conditions. So Veronica says, hey, we can partner with that. What if we created a thing called Delta Grace? And we started housing mission teams from around the world. The same way they did after Katrina. And those ladies said, sure, that'd be great. Here, let's make that our mission. And let's clean up the Sunday school areas, which was the old hallway where all the classrooms used to be. They worshiped in the auditorium. And let's do that. And she went to people like, I was pastoring at First Indianola at the time, and we paid for them a dump. First Indianola paid for them to put a big old construction dumpster out there. We invested in that. Inverness United Methodist Church invested in it. And there was a church out of Louisiana came in and put the roof on it for it. Stripped that old roof off, put a new roof on it. They did clean outs. It just emptied stuff out of those rooms. They started renovating it. And there was some action going on. And these 4 little old ladies had some folks that were related to them that started coming to church with them every once in a while. And some of their grandbabies. And some people that were members. You know, most of the time people can't tell you where they went to church Sunday, but they can tell you where they were supposed to be. You know what I mean? Well, I'm a member down at First Baptist. I ain't been in a while, 2 years, but that's why I'm supposed to go, because I'm a member, right? Okay. So, there's some people in the town start saying, hey, well, we'll help you out, Veronica. Yeah, we'll help you out. And all of a sudden, 4 turns into 12 attending on Sundays. And one little bitty kid. One kid. And all of a sudden, that's 18, and then it's 24 folks coming. Right? And Skipper died. I mean, right? Just, there's people are coming back. And this is in a town of less than what? 700-800 people? Probably? Yeah? Do you know Skipper? Yeah. I mean, this is a dying Delta town. And the church is starting to grow because they're starting to get a mission. And then they start to actually bring in a team. And that the church is growing. I want to tell you about a gentleman that 20 years before walked away from church because his son was killed in a 4-wheeler accident. And he walked out of his son's funeral and he said, how can I believe in a God that hated me that much that would let my son die? In 20 years, he had never darkened the doors of his church. Only reason he ever came back to church was because his daughter got married and had babies, and they had little school programs and little children's programs at my church, and he'd come to see that, and he'd sit in the back and leave as soon as it was over with. But he said, I'll never go back. And then he walked into that church and sat down one Sunday because he got roped into helping do some rebuilding work because he was a farmer. And a year later, he's playing Jesus in the Easter program. And his life is renewed. And he's healed in ways that we can't even imagine. And he is made different. And that is what the power of vision can do. When 4 little old ladies say, it's fine, I'll give anything up to make that vision happen. And people get passionate about it, and you got a hard-headed preacher that don't know any better. So being small does not mean you have to die. We die because we don't have a vision. All right, I got to take a break, guys. Let's take 5.